Welcome everyone to our online worship on this 29th of November, or the first Sunday in Advent. It's the first Sunday in the new year when we follow the church calendar. Interesting text for the first Sunday of the year. Today Jesus gives us a warning. He was never hesitant to remind us to expect suffering in this world. Jesus suffered, his followers suffered, and every human born will go through times of great distress. Watch what you do when life overwhelms you, Jesus warns us in today's reading. Oh yes, there are plenty of choices in how we cope with pain, but they are not always helpful and ultimately don't give us the rest and the peace we truly long for. A reading from Luke 21. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, the stars, and on the earth great distress among the nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves, and people will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in on a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. And then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they spout leaves, you can see for yourself and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on your guard, so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day catch you unexpectedly, like a trap. For it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth. Be alert at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that will take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Today is the first Sunday in Advent, and as we just heard in that reading, it's all about the end of the world as we experience it. Advent, it's the 4 Sundays that lead up to the birth of Christ, Christmas. And a couple things happen in Advent, and they're two opposite things in some ways. It's hard to hold these two things together. One of the things we remember during Advent, or which Advent means the coming, one of the things we're remembering is Jesus coming the first time as a man into the world. The baby born in Bethlehem. So that's one thing that we remember during the Advent of Christ. The second thing we remember is after the baby's born and grows up and dies and is resurrected, one of the things Jesus said is, I'm coming back again. So that's why we have this second coming. So there's like two things that we're holding on to. The first coming, when God came to earth and took on the form of a man, and then we're also looking forward to the second coming. So Jesus said this, he's coming back, and he also said that before he returns, and it's really about the closing down the end of the age as we presently experience it. Before that happens, there will be certain signs and things that will take place. Now, before I even tell you what the signs are, we're already experiencing them. They are already a part of our world, and they have been a part of our world ever since Jesus said this 2,000 years ago to the first listeners. These are very, very common signs that are happening in the world. So he said, before I return, or before the closing down of the age, there's different ways of talking about it, the ushering in of the kingdom. He said there's going to be earthquakes and famines and spiritual deceivers, people that will lead you astray, and there's going to be persecutions. People will be persecuted for their faith. All these things have happened. Time and time again, century after century. They still are to this present day. So really what he's doing is he's warning us in advance, as he was the first listeners, that the world is full of suffering and chaos, which doesn't sound like good news at all, because you have to really come to the end of the story here. But he's really saying that the world is not as stable and as secure as we would like it to be. There are wars, and there are rumors of wars, and there's suffering in the world. And he's telling us in advance so that we won't fall into despair when we go through times when we feel that our lives are shaken up in some way. Because we're all going to experience this. You can't be human and live in this world and not suffer. It's just not possible. And so it's like he's telling us in advance, in this world, well, in one of the Gospels he said, in this world you will have trouble. Now that can look like many, many different things. It could be like you could be shaken up over the death of a loved one. You could be shaken up over a bad diagnosis. Or you could have a broken relationship that you think is beyond help. You could have all sorts of internal struggles. You could be worried about the dying planet, or the drought, or the fires, or you could be weighed down by the pandemic and all the losses and associated losses from the pandemic. You could be weighed down by the violent world that we live in, or the transitory nature of life. There's a million things that could weigh you down. Jesus addresses that in our passage this morning. What do you do when you feel weighed down? What do you do when you feel weighed down? Well, he says, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near, in verse 24. Which is kind of a paradox, isn't it? When things are at their worst, look up, lift up your head, because God's there, and God's coming, and God will help you. It's almost like he's saying to us, you need to know where your security is found, and you have to keep reminding yourself of this. We need to learn how to lift up our hearts, or lift up our heads, or another way of saying it is look to God. We have to learn how to look to the one who cannot be shaken in our secure world, because we're in a world that is shaking up, is being shaken up, and we're a part of that. And so Jesus is saying, it's almost like you have to be careful, he says. Otherwise, 34, your hearts will be weighed down. Now, I think it's safe to say that we've all experienced this. We know what like it is to have a heart that is weighed down, or overwhelmed maybe by the things of this world. Sometimes the world just seems too much for us. It's all addressed in this passage today. He's saying that life can oppress us. There are lots of challenges in this life, and our inner life, our spiritual life, our inner life is really no different than any other area of our lives. So, for example, if you desire a strong, if you desire a stronger inner life, meaning you're looking for some peace in here, you're looking for some sort of stability and some sort of peace when everything else is shaking, it doesn't just happen. You know, you don't wake up one day and like, oh, I have a little bit of a feeling like I'm a little bit stronger in my inner life, my spiritual life. I'm feeling like I'm a little stronger. It usually doesn't just happen. It's usually something that how would you say it? I guess you have to work on it. If you're in good physical shape, you have done something to stay in good physical shape, right? If you can cook or paint or fix things, let's say you're very good at fixing things, you've practiced that, you've learned how to do that. If you've been successful in business, you've put some energy into that. You've put your attention toward that. It doesn't just happen, right? You've worked on that. It's the same with our inner life. Inner peace, shalom, as Jesus called it, doesn't just happen. We don't suddenly it doesn't just drop from the sky in the midst of chaos. It's really something, I think, that Jesus is teaching here that's cultivated. Doesn't matter if you can sing, or if you can write, or if you play sports, or if you decorate your house well. The reason that you can decorate your house well or play sports well is because you've practiced it. You've paid attention to that and you've put energy into that. I think the same phenomenon happens with our inner life, with our spiritual life, our inner landscape. It doesn't just happen. If we want to develop a stronger, more stable sense of self, that is going to get us through the ups and downs of life, Jesus would say, well, you got to be aware of that. You have to be aware of that. The in phrase now is be mindful of. Jesus didn't use that be mindful of phrase. He used phrases like stay alert, keep awake. Stay alert or be awake. He says there's a couple of things in this passage he points out, and they're interesting things that he picks out. There's a couple of things that can really weigh you down. There's a couple of things that you will be drawn to do because it's the common way of the world and people. There's a couple of things that you'll be drawn to do, tempted to do, and ultimately they're not going to help you. And a couple of things he talks about is, first thing is something that we never talk about. The first thing is dissipation. And I'll link it together with drunkenness because it's a bit similar. Because it's a really interesting combination. Because he's saying this is something that you think might help, and it's not going to help. And dissipation is all about excess. It could be about medicating. We talk about that today. But it's really about anything that you do to satiate yourself. So if you think about taking an empty sponge and then you plunge that sponge into water and you satiate it, that's kind of the picture of what he calls dissipation. So he's saying, don't entertain the idea of medicating or entertaining your way through life's ups and downs, because that's a false promise, he's saying. That's like a temptation. Dissipation, excess, satiating yourself into something. It's a little bit like overindulgence, which is rarely spoken about nowadays. We don't really hear too often about the spiritual dangers, the inner dangers, the inner life, the peace stealers of overindulgence. And it can be overindulgence in anything, you know. Yeah, I mean, it can be common things like drinking too much and eating too much. It could be that. But it could be excess in any area. I mean, it's sort of like whatever you use to take yourself out of this moment, out of this world, so that you don't have to be here. You could be reading historical novels. You could be watching movies on TV. You could be shopping online or not online. You could be, if you're drawn to the computer. Jesus is saying, you know, any kind of excess promises escape. It promises relief. it gives relief enough for a short time, but ultimately the peace, oh, it doesn't give peace, it's distraction. It doesn't work in the long run, he's saying. Pay attention to how you deal with stress. Pay attention to how you deal with grief. You may be drawn to certain things that ultimately don't help. How do you deal with fear? How do you deal with fear for yourself, for your children, for your grandchildren, for living, just living in this world? Let me tell you what isn't helpful, Jesus is saying. Don't get weighed down by dissipation. Don't satiate yourself in the wrong things. Ultimately, it's false. Whether it's overspending or overworking. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that apparently people for centuries have coped with stress in the same way. I mean, this was written 2,000 years ago. He's saying overdoing something, overdoing anything, actually doesn't bring what you're looking for, because what we're all looking for is inner peace. We want rest for our souls. We're burdened, we're weighed down. And Jesus is saying, yes, I know you are, but let me tell you what won't help, and what won't help is this satiating yourself in whatever the culture is offering you at this time. Obviously, the first people didn't have the internet the way we do, so that wouldn't be their problem. They would have other problems. But certainly, Jesus points out that what we do with our body affects our inner life. We have a lot of information on how to look after our bodies, but we don't have a lot of information on what looks after our soul, our spirit, our inner life. And Jesus said our body and our soul life, they are so connected. What you do with your body affects your spirit. And, we can satiate ourselves. It doesn't necessarily have to be awfully bad things. We're not necessarily talking about drugs here. It could be drugs, but I mean, it could be anything. You could be overextending yourself, or you could be trying to accomplish too much. That might be your go-to. When you're really stressed, you just keep producing. That's a tricky one. That is a really tricky one, because we are affirmed for doing the very thing that harms us. We can consume too much of anything, really. So Jesus is warning us about this. He's saying, you look, in the world, you're going to have trouble, but you have to be careful what you do when trouble comes. I think Jesus wants us to learn how to live in this world with a degree of detachment in some ways. Because all excess, everything in the world that the world offers, that kind of excess pulls us away from God. And when we're pulled away from God, we're pulled away from peace, right? This is the Prince of Peace we're speaking of. So the further we move away from God, the further we lose our peace. Be on your guard, he says, so that your hearts aren't weighed down with dissipation. Leads to a sort of inner deadness, a lack of life. You're no longer reading the signs well. There's more to going on here than meets the eye. You need to be spiritually alert to read the signs of the times, to really know what's going on, rather than just read the surface stuff all the time. So, I mean, he's not saying don't overdo things because it's not good for you. It's bigger than that. It's deeper than that. He's saying don't be deceived. There's a lot of empty promises out there. They don't deliver what they're promising to deliver. In fact, they suck the life out of you. So be careful. Don't satiate yourself in the wrong things. Do you know what's life-giving? Can you tease apart what is truly life-giving for you? Because that's where you're going to want to put your energy. It's the idea that we can get so caught up, so addicted to something, or caught up in something. You can actually even be addicted to your own way of thinking and seeing the world, which we are. You can be so caught up in all of that that you miss what's truly going on. So he's saying that this dissipation, this satiation weakens you. And another thing he mentions that weakens us, which I thought was fascinating if you're only going to choose a couple things, he said worry. Worry is a temptation that weakens you. Interesting choices, because you don't necessarily see worry as a really, really bad thing, you know. I mean, it's like, isn't that what we do because we're human? Jesus would say, yeah, you've got to be careful of that. That can really weigh your heart down. That can really pull you down. You can lose hope if you worry too much. It seems like a small, harmless fault, you know, like feeling guilty all the time. It feels like a small, sort of harmless fault. But he's saying, no, that's a killer of peace. That's something to pay attention to. Worry is so powerful. Now, the thing about worry is, the thing that's tricky about worry is, there's no point in saying, don't worry, right? Because we know that if we're worried, we can't just turn it off, right? It doesn't work that way. You can be worried and know you shouldn't be worried, but still worry, because it's a very, very powerful energy. So in order not to worry, we have to be doing something else, right? Because we can't do two things at the one time. Now, Jesus' answer is, yes, you need to stay alert and you need to pray, which he says in 36, which is really about praying as in, you get to choose what to dwell upon. Okay, so it's not pray as in give God a long list of all your anxieties that will make you more anxious. We're talking about prayer here. We're talking about Jesus is saying, you get to choose what to think about. Now, this isn't easy, but he is saying it's possible. You get to choose what to dwell upon. You can focus upon, or we can think about and dwell upon and rehearse the wrong things. When we do that, it weighs us down. But he is saying we get to choose what to dwell upon. We get to choose what to focus upon. So we have capacity, with the help of God, to choose to dwell upon something else. In this passage, he says, you get to choose to lift up your hearts. You get to choose to lift up your head. It's like, yes, there's going to be things that threaten to bow us down in this world. Some seasons are a lot worse than others. Some of us are going through seasons that are really difficult. This whole year has just been one loss after another. Others, not so much. I mean, it definitely seems to be a seasonal thing, in my experience anyway. But if we are going through a season of loss, if we are going through a season of suffering, if our heads are bowed down, if we are feeling like the world has really shaken us at some level, and life is not the same, nor will it ever be the same, and that's distressing to us. It's so fascinating that every single generation for 2,000 years and even before this since Jesus spoke these words, has had to grapple with this reality that the world is not as secure as we would like it to be. Every living being, every human being that's come into the world has to grapple with the same things that we grapple with. And the paradox of it all is that Jesus is saying, in the midst of all the chaos, God remains the same. This is what faith is all about. And God is unshaken, and God is moving forward. God has a plan. It might not look like a plan to us. It might look like things are going from bad to worse. Jesus is saying, absolutely not. Lift up your head, for your redemption draws near, which is a way of saying God is completely in control here. Not only of us in our individual lives, but on a much, much, much larger cosmic spectrum that we can't even get our heads around. God is doing something. God is moving. God is moving toward a particular goal. The goal in biblical language is redemption, or making all things new. How would we say that? I don't even know how to even use language for that. I'm sorting things out in a way that you can't even imagine that is good. I don't know how you would even say these things. But in the midst of being shaken, Jesus is saying, can you let this be the foundation of your life? Can you remind yourself of this when you're sinking down? Can you lift up your head when you feel like you would really rather just bow it down? Can you lift up? Remember the psalm? I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? Every generation's had to do this. We're no different. Every age has had to do this. We have to change our focus, change our thinking from looking down into the chaos to looking up. Many ways of saying it: looking up to the cross, looking up to the hills, wherever our help comes from, looking up to Christ, looking up to God. There's the heart cry. There's the heart cry. Jesus is saying, I am coming. I have a plan. Everything is in control. Can you trust me in the midst of all of this? There's the heart cry. There's the prayer. God, help me to hold on to you, the one who is never shaken in this chaotic world. Amen.